Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest aliens and UFOs video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue the book UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. This time starting a whole new chapter, chapter 7, something that already looks very tantalizing. In this case, the chapter is titled Military UFO Encounters. So we've just talked about Majestic 12 on one of the other videos and then about government responses. Here, this chapter will actually dedicate itself to actual encounters with the military. So how about that? There are several segments to discuss here. I'm going to place them throughout various parts of videos as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's start part 1. And in this case, the segment is titled Extreme Measures. So here's what it states. One of the most commonest misconceptions among people who are unfamiliar with the history of ufology is that UFOs are only seen by kooks, untrained observers, or starry-eyed dreamers yearning for a sign that is all too well in the heavens, if not on earth. However, as we have seen, this is far from being the case, and in this chapter we will take a look at some of the most impressive encounters that have occurred between military forces and apparently genuine UFOs. One such case is supplied by Captain Edward J. Ruppelt in his 1956 book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Although Ruppelt does not provide the exact date or location of the encounter, it seems to have occurred in the summer of 1952 when an uncorrelated radar target approached a U.S. Air Force base, prompting the scrambling of two F-86 Sabre jets. Presently, one of the pilots spotted a saucer-shaped object in the distance and altered course to intercept. But when he got to within 500 yards, the object accelerated away. The pilot began to fire at the object, which immediately climbed out of sight. The base intelligence officer who had passed the information to Ruppelt claimed that he had been ordered to burn all copies of the incident report, but had managed to keep one. Occasionally, UFOs have been known to take more than merely evasive action when faced with hostile action by terrestrial pilots. In 1967, two Cuban jets were scrambled to intercept a strange object. Their radio communications were monitored by U.S. Air Force agents who heard one of the pilots tell his base that the other jet had opened fire on the object and had then disintegrated without exploding. According to Stanton Friedman, the tapes of this conversation were sent to the National Security Agency, which listed the destruction of the Cuban aircraft as equipment malfunction. The U.S. Air Force suffered a casualty of its own November 23, 1953, when an F-89C Scorpion jet was scrambled from Kinross Air Force Base to intercept a radar target over Sioux Locks, Michigan. The jet was piloted by Lieutenant Felix Moncla Jr., Also aboard was an observer, Lieutenant R.R. Wilson. The Scorpion was vectored to the target by the controller at the Air Defense Command Ground Control Intercept Station that had first detected this intruder. As the Scorpion approached, the UFO abruptly altered course. On his radar screen, the GCI controller saw the two blips of the jet and the UFO merge into a single blip, which vanished from the scope after a few moments. Assuming that the Scorpion had collided with this unidentified target, the controller alerted search and rescue teams, which searched the area that night in the hope that the two pilots had managed to eject from their aircraft before the collision. No trace of them or the Scorpion was ever found, however, and the Air Force has never been able to explain the fate of Lieutenants Moncla and Wilson. On October 18, 1973, Captain Lawrence Cognier apparently managed to avoid a similar disaster during a helicopter flight from Columbus, Ohio to Cleveland. The Air Force Bell Huey helicopter, carrying 3 additional crewmen, Crew Chief Robert Yanisek, co-pilot Arrigo Jezzi, and Staff Sergeant John Healy, took off at 10:30 p.m. By about 11:10 p.m., the craft was flying at 2,500 feet over Mansfield when Yanisek saw a red light approaching rapidly from the east. Kanye immediately took evasive action, initiating a powered descent to 1,700 feet, but the object remained on a collision course. Having no other alternative, Kanye embraced himself for a probably lethal impact. But when it was no more than 500 feet away from the helicopter, the UFO stopped suddenly, and the Air Force crew were able to quite clearly discern its shape. It was dull metallic gray in color, 60 feet long, and was shaped like a fat cigar. The red light that had alerted them to the object's arrival appeared to be mounted on its nose, while the rear end contained a number of flickering green lights. At the center of the cigar was a dome. The helicopter's cockpit was suddenly flooded with a green glow from one of the rear lights of the UFO. Kanye called the control tower at Mansfield Airport to ask if there were any high performance aircraft operating in the vicinity. There was no response from the tower, even though it had acknowledged that the helicopter was there moments before. The radio had gone dead on both UHF and VHF frequencies. It was then that Kanye realized that although the controls were still set in the full down position, the helicopter was actually gaining altitude at a rate of 100 feet per minute and had reached 3,500 feet by the time Kanye managed to regain control. The helicopter then completed its journey to Cleveland. Interestingly, this encounter was also witnessed by observers on the ground who described the UFO as looking like a blimp hanging over the helicopter. Civilians are occasionally put at mortal risk through military encounters with UFOs. One such tragic case occurred on July 2nd, 1954, when an F-94C jet was instructed to intercept a balloon-shaped UFO that had been sighted over Walesville, New York. The above description would seem to imply that the UFO probably was a balloon, but for the events that subsequently unfolded. According to the official report produced by Air Force investigators, as the pilot approached the UFO, the temperature in his cockpit increased abruptly, prompting him to check his instruments. The fire warning light was illuminated, so the engine was shut down, and the two crew members ejected safely. The F-94 then crashed in Walesville, destroying 2 buildings and a car, and then killing 4 people. The Air Force investigation concluded that the UFO was indeed a balloon, although this hardly squares with the tragic conclusion of the sighting or the causes of that conclusion. The next segment is called The Mystery of the Atlas Missile. According to Dr. Robert Jacobs, a former first lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force and subsequently assistant professor of radio film TV at the University of Wisconsin, an Atlas missile was destroyed by a UFO at Vandenberg Air Force Base, California on September 15, 1964. At the time Dr. Jacobs was in charge of the filming of missile tests at Vandenberg, his team had set up a TV camera, affixed it to a powerful telescope on a mountain overlooking the base. According to Dr. Jacobs, he said, "We kept the telescope locked onto the moving missile by radar, and it was while we were tracking one of the Atlas F missiles this way that we registered the UFO on our film. We had a crew of 120 men, and I was in charge. As we watched the Atlas F in flight, we were delighted with our camera, which was doing fine. In fact, we were jumping around with excitement, with the result that because we were doing this, we actually missed seeing the most important bit of all, our missile's close encounter at an altitude of 60 miles with a UFO. I only heard about it, in fact, a couple of days later when I was ordered to go and see my superior, Major Florence J. Mansman, Chief Science Officer of the unit. With him, there in his office, there were a couple of men in plain clothes. He introduced them to me only by their first names and said they had come from Washington, D.C. Then Major Mansman had the film of the test run through. And just at that point where my men and I had been busy congratulating ourselves and each other, Major Mansman pointed to the screen and said, "Watch this bit closely." Suddenly, we saw a UFO swim into the picture. It was very distinct and clear, a round object. It flew right up to our missile and emitted a vivid flash of light. Then it altered course and hovered briefly over our missile, and then there came a second vivid flash of light. Then the UFO flew around the missile twice and set off 2 more flashes from different angles, and then it vanished. A few seconds later, our missile was malfunctioning and tumbling out of control into the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles short of its scheduled target. They switched on the office lights again, and I found myself confronted by three very intense faces. Speaking very quietly, Major Mansman then said, "Lieutenant, just what the hell was that?" I replied that I had no idea. Then we rammed the film through several more times, and I was permitted to examine it with a magnifying glass. Then Mansman again asked me what I thought, and I answered that in my opinion, it was a UFO. Major Mansman smiled and said, "You are to say nothing about this footage. As far as you and I are concerned, it never happened, right?" Here then was the confirmation of what the UFO experts had been saying for years past, that the US government was covering up on what it knew about UFOs. The film was turned over to the two men in plain clothes from Washington, who I believe were CIA agents. The film hasn't been heard of since. Major Mansman added, "I don't have to remind you, of course, of the seriousness of a security breach." It's been 17 years since that incident, and I've told nobody about it until now. I have been afraid of what might happen to me, but the truth is too important for it to be concealed any longer. The UFOs are real. I know they're real. The Air Force knows they're real, and the U.S. government knows they're real. I reckon it's high time that the American public knows it too. If we accept that the UFO witnessed in association with the Atlas missile was a genuinely anomalous object that was indeed responsible for the missile's failure, then two alternative explanations present itself. One is that the vivid flashes emitted by the UFO were projected perhaps by some kind of weapons system, recalling the frequently voiced claim that the aliens are intensely concerned with humanity's advances in military technology. It might have even assumed that the Atlas was being launched in a belligerent move against it. However, this does seem to have been an isolated incident, although there is some evidence to suggest that other such incidences have occurred elsewhere. For example, the Ellsworth case to be discussed later, in which case one wonders why this particular missile was targeted. The other possible alternative is that the UFO subjected the missile to some kind of sensor in an attempt to gain information of the missile's various electrical and mechanical systems. The energy fields generated by this sensor may have proved too powerful for the delicate innards of the Atlas, resulting in a serious damage to the missile's guidance system. Of course, this is extreme speculation, and it would doubtless be very helpful if the U.S. Air Force released the results of the investigation it surely conducted into the missile crash. So let's go ahead and let's pause it here and then talk about these two segments. First off, interesting chapter, right? It definitely hinted at military UFO encounters, and we're getting them by the boatload here. So let's talk about the first segment, extreme measures. Here you have several encounters, and in one case it was Captain Edward J. Rappelt, who was talking about some kind of radar target that was approaching a Air Force base, which prompted two F-A-6 Sabre jets to basically go out. Interesting that no matter how close they got, in this case 500 yards, it accelerated away. One of them actually fired on it, which caused it to actually climb or move so fast it was out of sight. So that's at least one encounter there. Then there was the other encounter involving those two Cuban jets. How about that? One of them also fired on a UFO, and then shortly after it was seen as being disintegrated, even though there was no explosion or nothing else that seemingly hit that plane. Talk about finality when it comes to that too. Then there was the other segment involving November 23rd, 1953, and then that's when there was a jet, an F-89C Scorpion jet that was sent out to investigate something that was intercepting a radar target. The two blips, in other words, the plane and this unidentified object merged, and then it simply vanished. How creepy is that? No known instance of what happened to the jet. No known instance of what happened to the pilot as well. No trace of the pilot or the other person that was there too, the observer, and the Air Force has never been able to explain it. I might talk about this one most in a future video because this one definitely intrigues me. And then there was some other examples involving, in this case, Captain Lawrence Cognier, who also averted a disaster, a helicopter that almost collided with a UFO until it stopped and started observing them. And then there was that poor unfortunate circumstance where a balloon or potential UFO was being targeted by an F-94C jet, but something happened and caused the jet to overheat. And when that happened, the pilot ejected, but then it basically plummeted to the ground, hitting a location, a building, a car as well, and then causing those deaths of those 4 people. So talk about what could be the first instance of deaths associated with a UFO battle, if you will. Next segment was the mystery of the Atlas missile. Once again, interesting stuff. Never heard about this before. Might talk about it in a video as well too. Here you have the situation of inadvertently a missile test catching a UFO, examining the missile multiple times, emitting some kind of strange lights, some kind of strange radar, and then causing the missile to basically plummet off course. But none of them saw anything. And were those CIA agents? What do you guys think? Were they men in black? Let me know as well. There were clearly 3 of them, all of them by first name only, and apparently looking intently on that dude, that guy that filmed it, Dr. Robert Jacobs, with the other guy, man's man, telling him, you better not talk about this. You're not going to say anything about this footage, and it never happened, right? Makes you wonder essentially what caused this guy 17 years later to truly decide. He was stating it was something along the lines of the truth is too important, but something else seemed to have been just gnawing at him, and he finally revealed it. I wonder where that film is also. That truly is some of the best footage, if it exists, showcasing something like that of a UFO encounter. But let me know what you guys think. Post those comments below. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.